certain topics that never really lose their importance. Mergers and acquisition is one such subject. It's never really out of news, always trending. And not only that, it's been evolved over time. There have been now alternatives to traditional M&A. And in this video, we would be focusing on these alternatives to traditional M&A deal making. We would be focusing on what are these alternatives and what are the factors basis which the companies are actually preferring these alternatives, and what does the future hold for M&A. To discuss this and much more, we have an expert with us. We have Ms. Neela Badami. She is partner at Samvad Partners. She's an expert in private equity, venture capital, and mergers and acquisition. Welcome, Neela, on board. Thank you for taking time out for us. So to start a conversation, as we just mentioned that, there have been alternatives coming up for traditional M&A. So if you can briefly explain to our audience, what are these traditional and non-traditional M&As, that have been coming up?
Sure, Sanya. Happy to talk about this. So let me explain a little bit about the traditional M&A structures as well as the alternatives. So as the phrase indicates, mergers and acquisitions are two distinct classes of deals. So the term mergers in the Indian context typically refers to schemes of amalgamation, which are to be approved by the National Company Law Tribunal. Acquisitions, on the other hand, are primarily contractual arrangements. They are typically structured as share purchases or asset purchases. So these are some of the traditional M&A structures. Coming to alternative forms of M&A structures, these include alliances, partnership agreements, cooperation agreements, incubation type investments, acqui-hire transactions, corporate venture capital investments, amongst others.
If you can explain why are non-traditional methods adopted or preferred by the company, and what are the opportunities and benefits for which companies are preferring them?
Sure. Let me talk a little bit about why alternative deal-making structures are being preferred. So, Sanya, we live in a rapidly changing world, right? The pace of change all around us can be stunning, to put it mildly. So, alternative deal-making structures help acquirers and targets cope with uncertainty and rapid change. If I could put it this way, so alternative structures help both acquirers and targets on three fronts: speed, cost, and efficiency, right? So your traditional M&A deal making could take long periods of time and also be quite expensive, right? So an acquirer may spend months doing due diligence only to find at the end of it that there is some showstopper in there that prevents the deal from going through. Similarly, even if the acquirer finds that the target is an attractive one and spends a lot of money on going ahead with the acquisition, due to a variety of factors, the acquisition may not click, right? There may be a clash of cultures, and it may turn out that the acquisition was not deemed. So an acquisition or a merger in the traditional structure could fail for a variety of reasons, right? So the alternative deal structures help acquirers and targets better manage the risks associated with traditional deal making and also better manage the costs as well. This is not to say that obviously that they are completely devoid of risk, uncertainty, or expense, certainly not. It's just that they provide opportunities to better manage these risks and costs. I can explain this through a couple of examples. So let us take the example of an acqui-hire transaction, which is an alternative form of M&A. Now, what is an acqui-hire transaction? It is simply this, that the acquirer, instead of acquiring all of the shares of the target or all of the business of the target, simply chooses to acquire one important asset, which could typically be intellectual property, and will also sign on all of the employees of the target as its own employees. Now, what would be the benefits of this kind of transaction, right? So, the benefit would be one, that the acquirer is not saddled with a legal entity. In India, as you know, both setting up an entity or shutting down an entity can be quite a time consuming affair filled with red tape. And being able to do an acquisition in the acqui-hire form, one of the advantages is that you don't have to deal with with having to shut down the entity that the target's business was in, and you don't have to deal with even having to probably amalgamate that entity into your own. So that could be one advantage. Let's take another example of corporate venture capital investments. Now, what do I mean by corporate VC investments, right? So there could be established players, market leaders, big conglomerates, which are also dealing with a very rapid pace of change in today's day and age, right? So they are constantly being threatened also by disruptive technologies from new and emerging startups. So the corporate VC investment structure allows established players to take small stakes at a lower valuation in these new and emerging companies, and allows them to grow alongside, right? So you don't have to lay out a lot of capital on the table to acquire companies which may not have any track record. So it allows you to manage that risk and also plan for the future. And there are benefits also for the startup in this situation. It gets the benefit of having an established name as one of its backers from whom it has raised capital. It also gets access to the relationships and the contacts that the established player has. There are new sources of business and opportunities, and good opportunities for the disruptor on the scene to grow. So it's a win-win for both sides. And if in due course of time, if the acquirer finds that the investee in whom it has made the corporate VC investment is actually a suitable target for acquisition, then that can be consummated at a future point of time. So these are some of the advantages with alternative deal making.
That actually explains very well, what all options and, opportunities are there. That takes us to the next question, which means what are the issues and challenges that are faced in the process of these alternatives that exist?
Sure. So let me talk a little bit about the challenges with alternative deal structures, right? Let's stick to the two examples that we already discussed. So in the acqui-hire context, the challenge for the target is, well, it is left with the entity that it needs to wind down. So there is some amount of effort that needs to be put in to neatly close down that side of things. The second challenge can also be in terms of how do you ensure that the payouts make it find their way to the various stakeholders, right? So because obviously a merger or an acquisition is also a way to exit the selling shareholders. So in an acqui-hire, because there is no selling shareholder, how do you structure a payout? So that could be one challenge. And let's take the next example, right? We were talking about corporate VC investments. So what are some of the challenges in the context of this type of alternate deal making, right? So it could be that given time, as the relationship grows and matures, the two parties could find that their goals are no longer aligned, right? So at that point of time, then there needs to be a graceful exit created, and the two parties need to find a way to create an exit. And this obviously would involve both time and money. So that is something that would have to be managed. So sometimes the very features that make alternative deal making attractive, the flexibility aspect, the cooperation aspect, could also sometimes be the same factors that also make it challenging, right? Because obviously the acquirer does not have complete control over the target. He just may have, he, she, or it may have a say in the way the business is run, but not complete control. So you always run the risk of misalignment of goals and targets as the relationship unfolds.
Thank you, Neela, for actually sharing all of this to our audience. It will just help them understand overall, how these alternatives work. And now that takes us to our last question, which is obviously a lot of sectors and areas have been impacted by the pandemic. No matter how much we get used to it, we still have to go through this particular changing phase. Um, Although M&A was once a sector that was expected to take a hit, but from the news and the trends, looks like it has only picked up. So, if you can really share with our audience, how has the pandemic really impacted the future of alternatives in deal making for the company?
Yes, the pandemic has, as we all know, has been an extremely challenging time for everybody, and it's no different with the M&A sector. But I think that based on my perusal of studies by the big consulting majors, that the outlook for M&A activity, both traditional and alternative, is definitely looking up. So we look forward to a lot of activity in the sector in the days to come. And I hope these are not famous last words, but the future does look bright for the sector. So, uh,
Thank you, Neela, for simplifying this entire technical concept for our audience. Mergers and acquisitions can be at times tricky for people to understand, especially with these new alternatives that have come up, especially the new stacks that have, we see a trend in rising there. So thank you so much. Thank you for explaining all of this to our audience, and thank you for taking time out for us.
thank you, Sanya. It's been a pleasure being on this show.